I'm 102 years old. That number still surprises people. It buys me silence before conversation, the kind that feels respectful but is really just curiosity dressed up as reverence. People lean in as if age itself has polished my thoughts into something useful, something sharp and transferable. They expect wisdom. I don't correct them. But I also don't give them what they're hoping for. What I have isn't a lesson. It's an accumulation. And here's the uncomfortable truth I've learned too late to soften. Most of the distance in my life didn't arrive suddenly. It didn't crash in or announce itself with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, while I was occupied, while I told myself I was busy. I didn't lose my children in a fight, or a scandal, or a single unforgivable moment. They drifted while I kept my calendar full and my tone reasonable, while I said soon and meant it, while I believed that being needed somewhere else was the same as being important. I've lived long enough to understand that authority doesn't come from wisdom. It comes from accumulation, from all the moments you didn't think mattered enough to stop. I remember them all now. That's the part no one warns you about. I learned early how to stay quiet. In our house, feelings were treated like wet boots. You took them off before coming inside. My father came home tired every day in exactly the same way. His coat was hung with care, his jaw set, his words measured like rations. My mother learned to read the room before she spoke, and we learned by watching her. At dinner, conversation stayed on safe ground, weather, neighbors, the price of bread, small inconveniences phrased lightly. If something heavier floated up, my father would clear his throat, not loudly, just enough. It was a signal, and we all understood it. I watched my mother swallow sentences. I watched her hands pause mid-gesture and then lower. I watched her smile arrive late, like it had been called in from another room. No one ever said don't feel. They didn't need to. The lesson lived in the silence that followed any attempt. Once when I cried, really cried, after a boy at school shoved me into the gravel, my father handed me a handkerchief and said, "You're all right." It wasn't a question. It was a decision. I learned that being all right was expected. I learned that staying composed was praised. I learned that explaining yourself took too long and rarely changed anything. At church, stillness was holiness. At school, neatness was virtue. At home, quiet was love. So I became efficient with my inner life. I trimmed it down, folded it small, learned how to carry it without showing the weight. When I felt hurt, I said nothing. When I felt lonely, I found something to do. When I felt overwhelmed, I worked faster. By the time I was grown, I didn't think of this as restraint. I thought of it as maturity. I married a woman who laughed easily. Her laughter didn't ask permission. It arrived fully formed, filling rooms without trying. She noticed things other people missed. The way light shifted on a wall, the way a child's voice changed when they were tired. She asked questions that didn't end with answers. When we sat together in the evenings, she talked about small things. Something a child said, a sound she noticed on the walk home, and then she waited gently for me to meet her there. At first I did. I listened. I nodded. I offered responses that felt appropriate. I believed that was enough. But work came with its own language, and it was persuasive, urgent, necessary, temporary. I carried it home like a badge, like proof that I was doing what was required of me. "How was your day?" she'd ask. "Fine," I'd say. And it was, mostly. When she asked again later, hoping for something underneath, I'd say, "It's nothing." And I believed that too. Children arrived, loud and unpredictable, full of questions that didn't know when to stop or where to land. I loved them. I provided. I showed up to the important things. But importance to me had a narrow definition. It lived on calendars and in announcements. At the table, they talked over each other while my wife tried to translate the noise into meaning. I focused on cutting food neatly, on keeping order. When one of them sulked, I said, "You'll be okay." When another cried, I said, "Come on now." I thought I was offering stability. What I was offering was distance, disguised as calm. "I'm fine," became my reflex. "It's nothing," became my shield. These weren't lies. They were delays. And delays have consequences, even when no one names them out loud. Small moments stacked up the way dust does, quietly, invisibly, until the light hits it just right. A daughter lingered in the doorway once, clearly wanting something. I didn't look up right away. I said, "Just a minute." She nodded and left. I finished what I was doing. The minute passed. She didn't come back. A son tried to explain a disappointment from school. I listened halfway and offered a solution he hadn't asked for. He stopped mid-sentence, looked at me for a moment and said, "Never mind." I remember thinking he was learning independence. At night, my wife would sometimes turn toward me in bed and say my name softly, like she was testing whether it still belonged to her. I'd already be facing the other wall, eyes closed, breathing steady, not pretending, just practiced. "I'm fine. It's nothing. Tomorrow." Years went by on schedule. Birthdays were acknowledged, achievements were noted, conflicts were smoothed over quickly, efficiently. We became a family that functioned well, smoothly, from a distance. People admired us for it. I took that admiration as confirmation. The quiet break didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no raised voices, no final conversation that could be replayed and dissected for meaning. It began with fewer questions. My wife stopped asking how my day was. She told me things instead, and then, over time, she told me less. She began to fill the silence on her own, then stopped trying. The children stopped bringing small troubles. They saved their words for things that couldn't be ignored, and then, eventually, they saved them for other people. Phone calls shortened. Visits became efficient, planned, bounded by start and end times. Chairs at the table filled and then empty sooner. I noticed it vaguely, the way you notice the hum of a refrigerator after it stops, only because the silence feels different. Once, I tried to reach out. I asked my daughter how she was really doing. She paused longer than I expected, long enough for me to feel exposed. Then she said, "I'm okay." Her voice was polite, complete. I recognized it immediately. I'd taught her that sentence. After that, no one asked any more. Not because they were angry, not because they didn't care, but because they had learned I wouldn't stay long enough inside the answer. Withdrawal doesn't look like rejection. It looks like adjustment. They adjusted their expectations. I adjusted my routines. We called it peace. Years passed this way, quietly, respectfully. The kind of peace that doesn't require much effort because it doesn't reach very far. Losses came, expected ones, unavoidable ones, and were handled properly. There were condolences, arrangements, thank you notes written carefully. When my wife died, people asked how I was holding up. I said, "I'm fine." And I was, in the way I'd always been. The house became quieter but not unfamiliar. Silence had been living there for years already. The children came, stayed briefly, left again. They took care of what needed taking care of. They were kind. They were efficient. They loved me in the way they had learned to. Now mornings are quiet in a way I once admired. I sit by the window and watch the light move across the floor at a pace that feels deliberate, almost intentional. I drink tea I don't need to rush. The day stretches without asking anything of me. There are photographs on the wall, smiling faces, arms around shoulders, proof that I was present once, that I belonged inside those frames. Loneliness at this age isn't sharp. It doesn't stab or ache. It's smooth, worn down by repetition, like a stone handled too often. I don't ache for company. I notice the absence of interruption. Patterns are stubborn things. They outlive their usefulness. I still say I'm fine when the nurse asks. I still wave off concern with a practiced hand. Sometimes a letter arrives, brief, kind, informative, updates about lives that continue elsewhere. I read it carefully and then set it down. I could write more. I could say something now. But my sentences still want to be efficient, contained, safe. I tell myself I don't want to burden anyone. I've told myself that for decades. The truth is simpler and harder to admit. I don't know how to begin without ending quickly. I'm 102 years old. People still pause when they hear that. They still expect a revelation, a neat conclusion they can carry away. What I have is quieter. Distance doesn't always come from neglect. Sometimes it comes from consistency, from always being busy, from always being fine, from teaching the people closest to you that you don't require much attention, and then believing them when they oblige. I began this life certain that silence was strength, and I was right. It held everything together. It just didn't hold anyone close. The light has moved back to where it was when I started talking. That happens now. I'll finish my tea. I'll sit here a little longer. If someone asks how I am, I already know what I'll say.